All right, so today we're diving into some pretty choppy waters.
Choppy is putting it mildly.
Yeah, well, our listeners definitely flagged this as something they wanted to deep dive on. So, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is in Washington, D.C. for a 5-day diplomatic trip. But the timing is, well, shall we say, interesting.
To say the least, a brand new U.S. president with his hands full, trade relations are a bit frosty, and there's this whole 25% tariff thing looming overhead. I can see why people are fascinated by this.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope over a volcano right now.
So for our listeners who might not be following this saga blow by blow, can you give us the rundown of what these tariffs would mean, especially for Alberta?
Right, so we're talking about the U.S. potentially slapping a 25% import tax on, well, basically everything Canada sends their way. And for Alberta, whose energy sector is heavily reliant on exports to the U.S., this is a major, major threat. A 25% tariff on everything. Whew, that's gotta sting. Even for someone like me who doesn't speak fluent economist, that sounds like a big deal. What does that look like on the ground for people? I mean, what are the real-world consequences if those tariffs actually hit?
Imagine this. Everything at the store that comes from Canada, suddenly 25% more expensive. Cars, lumber, oil, even that delicious maple syrup. Prices would skyrocket, businesses could be forced to shut down, and consumers, especially in a place like Alberta that relies so heavily on that trade, would feel the pinch in their wallet.
Okay, so not good. And it's against this backdrop that Premier Smith decides to go rogue, refusing to sign that joint statement with the other premiers and the Prime Minister on how to deal with these potential tariffs.
It was a bold move, no doubt, and it immediately signaled that Alberta's playing a different game than the rest of Canada on this one.
Yeah, it's like she's saying, hey, we're open to other options here, which kind of leads us to the big question. Why this trip? Why now? What's the end game for Premier Smith here?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, we know from her public statements that her trip is focused on building partnerships with the U.S. But what does that actually mean? Is it about damage control, trying to soften the blow of potential tariffs?
Or is it something more ambitious?
Exactly. Is she trying to secure special exemptions for Alberta's energy sector, maybe strike side deals that benefit her province specifically?
Which is kind of stepping on the toes of the federal government, right? They're the ones who typically handle international trade deals. I mean, we've got the Prime Minister and various cabinet ministers down in D.C. all the time working on this stuff.
Right. And Ottawa has been very clear that they're prepared to retaliate with tariffs of their own if the U.S. goes ahead with this. So you've got the federal government gearing up for a potential trade war, and then you've got Premier Smith seemingly off doing her own thing.
Okay, so help me understand the strategy here. Is Smith playing a dangerous game?
Yeah.
I mean, could this backfire and actually make things worse for Alberta?
It's certainly a risky move. On the one hand, she could come back from D.C. with some concessions for Alberta, maybe even some new investment opportunities. But on the other hand, she risks further alienating the federal government and jeopardizing Canada's overall negotiating position with the U.S.
Right. I mean, the U.S. could just look at this and say, well, clearly Canada isn't united on this issue, so let's just exploit those divisions and play them off against each other.
Precisely. And that's a scenario no one wants, because in a trade war, everybody loses.
So we've got a province taking a seemingly independent stance on international trade. What does that say about the future of Canadian federalism? I mean, is this a sign of things to come, or are we going to see more provinces going their own way on the world stage?
That's a fascinating question. If Smith is successful in securing Alberta's interests, even if it means going against the federal government's approach, it could embolden other provinces to follow suit.
Right. Like, hey, if Alberta can do it, why can't we? So this trip could be a watershed moment in Canadian politics. But for our listeners, the question I'd leave you with is this. Think about the potential long-term consequences. If we start to see a more fractured Canada on the world stage, with provinces pursuing their own agendas, what does that mean for our country's influence, our ability to negotiate with global powers?
I don't think anyone has the answer to that yet, but it's certainly something worth watching closely as this situation unfolds.
Couldn't agree more. And we will, of course, keep you updated as the story develops.
It'll be an interesting ride. Buckle up.
Always. Thanks for listening.